Hello everybody. This is going to be the first video in a series that will be covering a book called Why Race Matters. I'm going to cover just the most important points. I'm going to basically just read the parts that I have highlighted and then expound on certain points when I feel it's necessary, when I have my own personal addendums. So without further ado, for the foreword, I'm just going to read the whole thing, but after that it's going to be just a few paragraphs per chapter, the parts that I found most interesting. So without further ado, the foreword by Jared Taylor. Oh, and one more point, Jared Taylor is a very interesting person, and I highly recommend you look him up. American Renaissance on odyssey.com, ODYSEE.com. There's a reason he's not allowed on YouTube. I was going to use a different word, but sometimes I like to refer to YouTube as something else tube, but I'm not going to say that here. But yeah, Jared Taylor, smart guy, and one of the best videos. Well, you'll see it pinned, but if you go to Odyssey and search for him. But one of his best videos is called Facts About Race in 13 Minutes, I think. So anyway, foreword by Jared Taylor. Oh, and the author of the book is Mark Levin, who is now one of my new favorite members of the Semitic community, you might say. I do make some exceptions. I treat people like individuals, okay? But also there are some group tendencies that we have to acknowledge. Here we go. I first became aware of Michael Levin in 1988. Good year, that's when I was born. When I read his book, Feminism and Freedom. It is a marvelous demonstration by a professor of philosophy doing what philosophers are supposed to do: apply the tools of rigorous thought to important and even controversial questions. I was so impressed by the quietly relentless way Professor Levin demolished fashionable feminist arguments that, for the first time in my life, I wrote a fan letter to an author. I got a reply, typed by hand, as letters were in those days. It was so pleasant and informative that I saved it. On rereading it now, I am struck by this passage. Quote, I've toyed with the idea of a second edition. As you shrewdly surmised, the whole experience of writing Freedom and Feminism has been an extremely unpleasant one, made bearable by letters such as yours, and I'm not sure I want to devote more of my life to such a thankless task as criticizing feminism. In fact, over the years, Professor Levin has devoted a great deal of his life to the thankless task of criticizing not just feminism, but other fashionable ideologies with equally shrill and powerful defenders. Professor Levin is one of the very, very few people in America willing to write unpalatable truths without regard for the consequences. Those consequences have generally been, as he described the experience of writing Feminism and Freedom, unpleasant. Professor Levin has established himself early as an iconoclast. In 1984, his 1984 article in The Monist, quote, Why Homosexuality is Abnormal, unquote. Good article, by the way. I read it after I saw it mentioned here. Very short, potent, logical. Why would you want your kid to be gay if it's, well, first of all, you're not going to have any grandkids. Second of all, don't you care about his asshole? Or, even if he's on top, still not healthy. So, anyway, He wrote an article called Why Homosexuality is Abnormal, which was already in his characteristically uncompromising style. But if the consequences of criticizing feminists and homosexuals were unpleasant, they were nothing compared to what was to follow. In 1988, Professor Levin and his wife, also a PhD in philosophy, wrote a joint letter to the New York Times in reply to an editorial. They argued that New York store owners were justified in what was later to be called racial profiling. That is to say, in refusing to open their doors to young blacks they were afraid might rob them. The Levins pointed out that the Times' inconsistency in worrying that some innocent blacks might suffer from this precaution when they were unconcerned that innocent whites might suffer from racial preferences, which the Times supported. Forcing people to associate with people that they don't want to associate with whom they don't want to associate, that violates freedom of association. Quote, anti-racist activists circulated the letter at City University of New York, where Professor Levin teaches, and picketed his classes. They were so menacing, the university assigned him a bodyguard. After a few weeks, the picketers got bored and went away, but calm did not return for long. The Australian magazine Quadrant had asked Professor Levin for an assessment of American education, and he described a number of its deficiencies. One observation, however, provoked outrage back in New York. Quote, there is now quite solid evidence that the average black is significantly less intelligent than the average white. End quote. The uproar was immense. It did not matter that Professor Levin's students of all races pronounced him scrupulously fair, or that in philosophy lectures he never talked about race. Demonstrators disrupted his classes and physically prevented him from speaking in public. Some people just really, really hate the truth. And they pretend that people's feelings are more important than the truth. The faculty senate called a meeting for which they did not give him enough notice to attend, and convicted him, in absentia, of racism. Acknowledging that races are different. Oh my God. Newsflash, they are. Anyone who pretends otherwise is either really stupid or being disingenuous. And as we'll cover later, do you think that genes, which are responsible for so many things, the length of your limbs, the shape of your head, the color of your hair, the color of your eyes, the way your voice sounds, everything physical about you is determined by genes, except your brain? No. Okay. So anyway, the faculty senate called a meeting. They convicted him of racism. For a time, he was forbidden to teach introductory philosophy. Once, when he went to his office, he found the door covered with swastikas and the message, "You effing JEW." A New York City editorial writer wrote that he was, quote, a horse's ass, end quote. Ad hominem. No argument. What a surprise. I only deal with that, well, basically every day. Every day that I make a comment on YouTube or Twitter, which, some days I don't, but people who think I'm wrong or claim to think I'm wrong, they absolutely never actually argue. Okay, not never. Almost never attempt to make an actual argument. They just call you names like a child. And somehow they think that's like, I wonder if they actually think that they like won. Anyway, perhaps most disturbing, City University's then president, Bernard Harrelson, who is black, made every possible effort to break Professor Levin's tenure. Americans are supposed to treasure freedom of speech, and universities are supposed to foster debate. But Professor Levin had to hire a lawyer to keep him from being gagged and fired. It was tenure that saved him. If Professor Levin had been a junior faculty member, he would almost certainly have lost his job. Perhaps it was this experience of the hysteria the subject provokes. Perhaps it was this experience of the hysteria that the subject provokes that inspired Professor Levin to write a full-scale treatment of the race IQ question. The result was Why Race Matters, Race Differences and What They Mean, which appeared in 1997. The book was immediately acclaimed as rigorous and exhaustive. Professor Levin expertly presented what was by then a huge body of data, but what most set his work apart from that of other scholars were the last 3 words of the book's title, quote, what they mean, end quote. Scientists and psychologists generally present their findings without much commentary, but philosophers are trained to follow an argument wherever it leads. Professor Levin not only presented the evidence for significant population differences in such important characteristics as intelligence, criminality, and even morality, but explained what they mean for society. For some readers, the impact of the book was almost physical. Joe Bradley of Southern California wrote, quote, read this book and I promise you that you will never think the same about race ever again. For me, it was like a left hook, jarring me out of my lifelong coma on the subject. Wow, sounds like a good book. Jack Judson of Downers Grove, Illinois, described the book this way. Professor Levin literally teaches you how to think better and to apply philosophical concepts to practical issues like race. As I read through chapter after chapter, I continually had the aha feeling of finally understanding something that was all too familiar, but that my previous conceptual scheme had forced me to misunderstand. I share this admiration for Professor Levin's work, and in my own case, admiration led to friendship. It has been my privilege to become well acquainted with Professor Levin, and also to meet his wife Meg. Parentheses. One of the first things he ever told me was that he gets his best ideas from Meg. Of our many pleasant times together, one stands out in my mind. I was visiting New York City and made an appointment to see Professor Levin at his office. I was on time, but cooled my heels while he attended to something more important. A student had dropped in unannounced, desperate for last-minute coaching for an exam Professor Levin was to give the next day. How I enjoyed the irony. The so-called racist and horse's ass kept an out-of-town visitor waiting, a white out-of-town visitor, I might add, waiting, while he patiently and earnestly explained symbolic logic to a black co-ed. Later, I asked Professor Levin whether he thought the young lady had any idea what a demon he was supposed to be. Probably not, he said. The controversy had died down. One thing she did appear to know was that she could count on him for help when she needed it. Professor Levin was not well served by the original publisher of Why Race Matters, which made the wrong-headed decision to print only a small number of books, just 500 copies, and sell them at an astonishing $65 each. Even at that price point, the book quickly sold out, and disappointed readers waited for another printing. They are still waiting. People lucky enough to own copies do not part with them. By the summer of 2005, internet bookseller Amazon.com had only 3 used copies for sale, one for $500, another for $505, and the last for $550. These are prices collectors pay for prized first editions of classics, which is exactly what this book has become. To have let this book go out of print so quickly is not just an inexplicable business decision, it is an affront to scholarship. It is therefore with great pride that New Century Books republishes Why Race Matters. We are happy to share with Professor Levin the pleasure of making available, once again, a work that sheds so much light on one of the most important questions of our time. I don't think I'll add too much commentary, because whatever I have to say, I'll probably address it later when we come across those points in the book. So I hope this piques your interest, and I hope you'll continue on this journey with me as we move on to Chapter 1.